Hi, I hope you folks are well. Welcome to my lecture on the first part of Elizabeth Anderson's book, Private Government. This is the assignment number 6 for the course. We're going to be looking at most of Elizabeth Anderson's book. She's got her author's preface, her first chapter, and her second chapter. This lecture is on that little 5 or 6 pages in the author's preface, as well as the entirety of chapter 1. Next time, I'll be talking about chapter 2. Then we're going to actually move on to a different work, David Schweikert's After Capitalism, and then we'll come back to some comments in Private Government. This book, Private Government, what it basically is it's a series of lectures that Elizabeth Anderson gave, and then there's commentary included in the book from various scholars. We're going to read some of that commentary and then Elizabeth Anderson's response. But we're not going to get to those responses until after we read David Schweikert, because I think David Schweikert will help us evaluate the back and forth between Elizabeth Anderson and some of her correspondence. So anyway, let me just say a little bit about Elizabeth Anderson, who she is. She's in political philosophy. She's a big deal. Mention where I fall on all this. She's one of my favorite political philosophers working today. She's at the University of Michigan, which is only about 5 hours from Mac, actually. If you want to, she's a theorist of equality. She's a political philosopher. If you want to read a bit more about her, what her project is, where she's coming from, there's actually a pretty cool New Yorker article from about a year ago, or maybe two, called "The Philosopher Redefining Equality." I don't think that's a very good title, because I think she's actually working solidly within this tradition that began with Rousseau. I think you folks will be in a position to see that she's just taking a lot of his ideas and applying them and working them out for today. But anyway, despite the title, I mean, certainly her work is about equality. Certainly she is pushing in a different direction than a lot of folks in political philosophy are today. But that direction is a course that was set a very long time ago, and as far as I understand it, by Rousseau. So let me begin with a few ideas that Anderson has. They're kind of the touchstones for the whole book. The first thing to do is to just say a bit about the way she's thinking about egalitarianism and equality. I think you'll see right away on page 3 that she's thinking about equality very much in the same way that Rousseau's thinking about equality. And one thing to keep in mind is that Rousseau's account of equality and this whole tradition of thinking about equality conceptually links the ideas of equality and freedom. To be free for these folks is to stand in certain kinds of relationships of equality with your fellow humans that you're interacting with in the social world. So I have here it says egalitarianism on the side. It could say non-domination as the title of the slide. It could say freedom on this title of the slide. For this tradition of philosophers, those two concepts, egalitarianism or equality and freedom, are tightly linked. And all of that, the common denominator is this notion of avoiding domination by others. Okay, so here's what Elizabeth Anderson says just right off the bat. To be an egalitarian is to commend and promote a society and in which its members interact as equals. And one thing that she's very clear on in her work, and it comes out here in Private Government, is that she's not so much interested in distributive equality, as in making sure that everyone has the same amount of income or the same amount of wealth, though that kind of equality is relevant, but it's not the first principal ideal of equality. The first principal ideal of equality is for people to interact as equals, and to interact as equals, particularly with respect to 3 dimensions. I've highlighted 2 of these dimensions already with Rousseau. In Rousseau, I think you can see this 3rd dimension as well, and Anderson explicitly brings it out in her work in general, but also in this book, Private Government. So to interact as equals, there are 3 dimensions in play. One is an authority relationship. Authority relationship is one that, without certain modifications that we'll get to in a bit, An authority relationship is a site of inequality or of hierarchy. An authority relationship is a relationship in which A orders, if you have two people, A and B in it, A orders and B obeys. A relationship where you're not interacting as equals is a certain kind of authority relationship where A orders and B must obey. And where you get the inequality is when you have a situation where B must obey and B has absolutely no input into the decisions that are his orders or her orders. Okay, so one dimension of equality revolves with this idea of the inequality that authority can bring with it. A second dimension of equality has to do with esteem. You can have equality or inequality of esteem. And the idea is that there might be a society that puts rules into place that entrenches demands for esteem as a superior. The paradigmatic sorts of behavior that goes with this is you're demanding that your counterpart bows or scrapes or fawns. Just it's kind of a supplicant. There's a kind of supplicant relationship. Paradigmatic relationship will be between a serf and a lord. But the idea is that you can get these rules, these norms of politeness, these norms of courtesy or what have you, where what's demanded is esteem as a superior. An egalitarian relationship is one where what's demanded by these norms is equal esteem, kind of an equal standing, an equal esteem for one another. No one bows and scrapes. Everyone takes one another to be equals in this sense. A third dimension is what Amscombe refers to as standing, where A's interests count much more than B's do. You have two counterparts. You could have an inequality of standing where A's interests are given much more weight when it comes to determining what the rules are that govern A's interactions with B's. A's interests are given much more weight than B's in coming up with those rules of relationship. So an egalitarian relationship would be one where there's equal standing, where the interests of all the parties to the relationship are counted and considered and reflected roughly equally. So to be an egalitarian for Anderson is to go for equality on all three of these dimensions and to avoid inequality or hierarchy on these three dimensions. Okay, so the first idea that is just a touchstone for Anderson is this idea of egalitarianism that I just described, her particular way of thinking about it. This is clearly within this Rousseauian way of thinking about what equality is, where equality is tightly bound to freedom and relationships of non-domination. Another idea that is in the background for Anderson, and that she mentions right away at the beginning of Private Government, is her idea of ideologies. And this idea of ideologies is also something that comes straight from this Rousseauian tradition. And this Rousseauian tradition, I should say, there's Rousseau, back in the late 18th century. There are a number of other folks. I would put Hegel within this tradition. I'd certainly put Kant, who came immediately before Hegel. So you'll go Rousseau, Kant, Hegel. I think they're all in this tradition. Then Marx, I would argue, is also in this tradition. And through all of this tradition, particularly with Hegel and Rousseau, and definitely with Marx, you get this idea within this tradition of an ideology. And an ideology is something that can be that can be good or it can be bad. In general, an ideology is an abstract, simplified model that people use to represent and cope with the social world. So the general idea of an ideology is just abstract. All the theorists that I just described, they recognize this notion that there are ideologies that are the lenses through which we see and categorize various objects in our social world and navigate our relationships within that world. And this is something that humans just need. We can't possibly cope if we don't have kind of a simplified model of the world and the relationships that we're living within. So we have a simplified model that makes up this ideology. We have a model where there's mothers and parents and fathers, and there's certain kinds of institutions, and we have these ideas that they relate to another in particular ways. And we have these ideas that there are certain values that justify these various relationships, that these relationships are about. So an ideology is something that humans can't help but have. It helps us navigate our relationships with each other in the social world. But a big point that folks in this tradition make, and that Anderson is relying on in this book, is that ideologies can be either pejorative or non-pejorative. And pejorative, to say something's pejorative is to say, well, it's there's something bad or problematic about it. To say something's non-pejorative is to say that there's nothing bad about it. It might even be benign or beneficial or felicitous. So Anderson sort of reminds us that within this tradition, you can have ideologies that are non-pejorative, and a non-pejorative ideology helps you identify important features of your social world. It helps you identify causal connections between those various features that people can respond to, and if you can anticipate these causal connections, you can manipulate and navigate this world well. A non-pejorative evaluation orients your evaluation of what is good and bad in the world, and it does it usefully, accurately, and it gives you a map for improving these various features in your social world. So these ideologies, in general, they could be good or bad, and here Anderson's emphasizing they can be quite good. However, they can be problematic as well. And this tradition, starting with Rousseau, I think you already see in Rousseau, like if you read the Discourse on Inequality closely, this whole bit about, say, about 2/3 of the way through, where the elites are proposing this contract that has all these high-flown ideals supposedly at its heart, but in fact, these ideals are going to be just tools that these elites are going to use to constrain and limit and obscure and deceive and manipulate the folks that they're going to govern and exploit. That's a pejorative ideology. So in general, you have ideologies that they're these abstract, simplified models that people use to represent and cope with the world. But then a pejorative ideology is an ideology that masks problematic features, such as domination relationships in the world, or casts those features in a misleadingly positive light. In Rousseau's Discourse, the elites say, look, we're going to put these relationships in a way that promotes equality and protects the weak, when in fact that wasn't what they were going to do at all. They were just going to use the form and the high-flown phrases and ideals to mask something else. So ideologies pejorative ideologies mask problematic features of our world, cast those features in a misleadingly positive light, or lack the concepts, the categories needed to identify what is problematic about them, or misrepresents the space of possibilities so as to obscure better options, the means to realizing them or their merits. So this is what a pejorative ideology does. Now, within this tradition I'm talking about, this tradition that's so concerned with domination relationships, a recurrent theme is that there's rhyme and reason to pejorative ideologies. Pejorative ideologies come on the scene when there's a domination relationship where an elite wants to hold on to its spot in the apex in that relationship, in that domination relationship. And to do that, a really important tool to do that is to promote and supply everyone with an ideology that casts this whole relationship in a misleadingly positive light. So, for example, in the feudal world, you might get these ideologies of duty and loyalty and honor that are bound up with obedience to your lord. Those would be ideologies, arguably, that try to convince people to live in these relationships that aren't necessarily in their interests. Now, I should say, so there is, certainly within this tradition, beginning with Rousseau, you see this distinction between pejorative and non-pejorative ideologies. But the person working within this tradition who coined those very particular ways of describing these things is Raymond Geuss. He has this book, The Idea of a Critical Theory, in 1981. It's a really cool book, and it's short. It's like 100 pages. And it's this very interesting account of this 100-page account of this distinction between pejorative and non-pejorative ideologies. And he's the one that uses those terms, pejorative and non-pejorative ideologies. Okay, so in the book Private Government, Anderson has in mind free market ideology. This is what she has in her target, in her sights. And Anderson's a nuanced thinker. She doesn't see the world in black and white. She sees it. She sees, I think, its various shades of gray. So first in Private Government, she describes this free market ideology without making a comment about whether it's pejorative or non-pejorative. So basically, a free market ideology, without commenting on whether it's pejorative and non-pejorative, we can say the free market ideology says something like this. There's the market economy, organizing a political economy in accordance with market and the outcomes that you get just through market transactions. That's a kind of economy that promotes values of freedom and equality. Now, just to be clear, just to try to fix ideas a bit, a market economy is any economy that's based on the exchange of goods and services for money on a voluntary contractual basis. Now, all of you folks are living under a market economy, and and your parents did, and their parents did, and this thing's been around for a very long time. So you might have the sense of, well, is there any other way to organize society? And the answer to that is, well, clearly yes. For example, those ancient grain states that we talked about, that was only to a very limited extent a market economy. Mostly, all the aspects of economic transaction and production, our economic production, were governed by a central command and control system. To the extent you had a market economy, it probably would have been between the various grain states. They would exchange goods, but within the grain state, there would just be this command and control and order type system. So feudal arrangements, the feudal arrangements that Rousseau lived under. He lived under the kind of the last stages of these feudal arrangements. These are basically really sophisticated versions of those grain states, and most economic production was done not in this sort of market-based way. It was mostly done through a kind of command and control. Lords told the serfs what to do, what to produce. Masters of guilds had artisans working under them, or apprentices working under them, and this was all a tightly controlled type of arrangement. But as we'll see, there's a transition out of this stuff. But anyway, so an economy can be organized around this non-voluntary arrangement where you're sort of just stuck doing certain things, and you don't have an option. You're a serf, and you've got these obligations, and that's what you're going to do. Or you're an apprentice, and you're slotted into this line of work, and this is what you're going to do. This is who you're going to work for, and this is how much you're going to produce. Now, another non-market-based arrangement is socialist command and control economies. The old Soviet Union would say, look, we're going to make this many cars this year, and we're going to make this many tanks, and we're going to organize all of our farms in this way, and they're going to be cultivated in this way. The market's not making any of these decisions. It's cadres of legions of bureaucrats making these various decisions. Aspects of our own economy are not market-based. Public schools, highways, armies, police, and so on. The market is not producing those goods. those goods are produced, roughly in a command and control way. So the idea then is that the free market ideology is going to say something like, look, having a market economy for a big chunk of the goods and services that we produce as the community, that kind of organization is going to promote the values of freedom and equality. That's the key tenet of this free market ideology. Okay, now, as I mentioned, Anderson, at least to my mind, is a highly nuanced thinker. She sees the world in shades of gray. And her chapters 1 and 2 are, I think, display that feature of her scholarship and her thought. What she wants to say is that this free market ideology actually, at its origins, in its time and place, it was actually a non-pejorative ideology. In fact, it's one that promised to deliver egalitarian goods. It was an egalitarian ideology. So chapter 1, what chapter 1 does is it tries to detail, how these various thinkers who are the original sources for us of this free market ideology, folks like Adam Smith, Thomas Paine, John Locke, theLevellers, Abraham Lincoln, all these folks, they defended a free market ideology that in its time and place, argues Anderson, was an egalitarian ideology. And as such, Anderson sees that ideology as one that is non-pejorative. It's actually one that was in the interests of most of the folks in the community who were being asked to adopt this ideology. Now, she thinks this changes, however. She thinks that coming with that everything changes with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution creates a world in which the free market ideology, developed in this pre-Industrial Revolution world, actually no longer fits. And insofar as you just blindly import the pre-Industrial Revolution free market ideology to the realities of the post-industrial world, Industrial Revolution world, you get something that's ideological in the pejorative sense, something that is, by and large, not in the interest of many of the folks that are being asked to adopt it. So her chapter 1 is a story about this non-pejorative version of free market ideology and its origins, and the very end of chapter 1 is about the thing that changed, that made that original free market ideology no longer something useful, a useful tool for folks to navigate and evaluate and improve upon their social world. In chapter 2, she's going to develop at further length this story about the now pejorative status of free market ideology and the suggestions about how we need to alter our understanding and also modify our institutions in ways that reflect the realities of contemporary political economy, and that also introduce this ideal of egalitarianism into these relationships. Okay, so basically Anderson has 2 questions that she deals with in Lecture 1 and Lecture 2 of private government. And Lecture 1 and Lecture 2 are, that's the bulk, that's the body of private government, what she has to say. As she puts it, Lecture 1 answers this question: why do we talk as if workers are free at work, and that the only threats to individual liberty comes from the state? And basically her answer is because we've imported an ideology for which it was true that workers have a chance to be free at work, and that the main threats to their liberty comes from the state. But she thinks that's not the case any longer in this post-industrial world. And so in Lecture 2, she takes her task to be to answer this question: what would be a better way to talk about the ways employers constrain workers' lives, which can open up discussion about how the workplace could be designed to be more responsive to workers' interests, where basically her view as an egalitarian is that their interests are to be folks who live in the workplace in a world that better incorporates egalitarian value, that gets rid of domination in the workplace. Okay, so now I want to focus on Anderson's bit of history, kind of her intellectual and political history of this transition out of a feudal political economy to something else. So, and some high points for her in this chapter. This is, she's focusing on the UK and some developments in the UK, but the idea is that this is happening everywhere in the world. But it's high points like this that you're going to see everywhere in the world, and this is going to explain like the rationale and the egalitarian bona fides of the free market ideology during this time period. This time period starting in somewhere in the 17th century, where we're starting to move out of the final stages of feudal organizations of the political economy. So high points for Elizabeth Anderson are, well, here I have them. So in the 17th century, what you have is, in the middle of the 17th century, you have this English Civil War. This English Civil War actually is really important in our intellectual and political history. This English Civil War is the thing that got some very famous political philosophers that we still read today really animated and curious and puzzled in writing all their main works. So Hobbes and Locke are responding to the developments in the English Civil War and thinking about how we should reorganize everything given this crisis. Now, what this crisis basically is a kind of struggle between the ancient order, this ancient feudal order with a king at top, and this newly nascent order where you're going to have a much larger, more inclusive swath of the populace making important decisions about the way that society should be run. So this is a struggle between this ancient order with a king at the top and the nascent, House of Commons, parliamentary representation in the UK. So some key high points in this struggle is the beginning of this civil war between these two forces, between the forces of the commons and the forces of the nobility in 1642. The introduction of this new model army that's going to support the interests of the parliamentary side of this struggle. 1649, you actually see monarch executed. Charles I is executed. And then for about a decade, you've got a parliamentary government with no monarchy playing a role in Britain until finally you get a kind of restored monarchy where the balance of power between the parliament and the monarchy have been adjusted to where the parliament is much, much more powerful than it was before the beginning of the English Civil War. Of course, not as powerful as it was at the height of Cromwell's rule, but still, we have this new equilibrium. Now, part of this movement, the sort of the animating actors, some of the animating actors in this movement are what Anderson describes as the masterless men. And folks also, and these other folks, levelers. John Locke was a theorist writing during this time period. He was loosely supportive of this kind of thought that preceded him by just a bit, but he was loosely supportive of these folks. I don't know. It's not. Locke was working within the nobility, but there's a side where, but he's working for a side that would have been, maybe you might call it the left wing of the nobility or something like that. So anyway, Anderson wants us to understand who these folks were that were, part of the energy, the animating, who were among the animating forces of developments such as these. during the 17th century in Britain. So her idea is that we need to understand what she calls these masterless men and these levelers. And to understand them, we need to understand the social order that they were railing against. The social order that they were railing against in this, particularly dramatic form of civil war in the 17th century. Okay, so let's say a little bit more. We've said a bit about this in previous lectures, but I will quickly recapitulate. We should say a little bit about this feudal social order that the masterless men and the levelers and folks like that were railing against. And one thing that I should make clear is that these folks are going to introduce this free market ideology. That's why we're focusing on them. Okay, so what are they railing against? They're railing against this feudal social order. In this feudal social order, here's a very simplistic picture of it, but it's close enough. In this feudal social order, you have this great chain of authority. You'll have the king at top, and then you'll have a whole bunch of lords that are under that king who are vassals, obligated servants to the king. They have duties that they can't escape to the king, duties of service of various sorts, duties to provide certain amounts of wealth and grain and people in case public works need to be built or a war needs to be fought. And then, of course, under these lords, there are yet another tier of lords and nobles, and then a whole bunch of commoners, of various folks who are bound by duties at birth to work for whichever lord they've been assigned to by way of being born in some part of the British world. Your birthplace determines which lord you're going to be under and the duties you're going to have for all of your life toward that lord. Anyway, the whole society is organized in that way. Everyone has a lord except for the king at the very top. And then the idea is that the king's supposed to report to God. Okay. Now, so that's one thread of this hierarchical structure that makes up the feudal social order. You've also got, other hierarchical structures that are semi-autonomous from that part that I just described. You've got the clergy, where you've got at the very top bishops and priests under them, and then priests have a kind of authority relationship with their parishioners. You have this whole, kind of military chain of hierarchy. You have guilds, these are artisans, bridle makers, watchmakers, all these various things. You have guilds that govern these different areas of production of, crafts and goods of various sorts, and blacksmiths, on and on. And they're organized in these hierarchical relationships with duties that are assigned to you. And you're kind of just locked into, one way of making your keep under these guilds, assuming that you're not a peasant working on someone's land somewhere. Okay, so and then also there's this other hierarchical relationship, which is there are male heads of household that govern the whole domus, or the whole domestic scene. The male head of household governs the wives, children, servants. It's kind of the king of that whole thing, and with probably sons, maybe some daughters, or the wife having a kind of authority over some folks that are under them. So you have these. But the idea is that everyone reports to someone. No one is free of an obedience relationship except for the king at the very top. In all these domains of your life, you are embedded in some chain of authority. Now, here's a key notion for Anderson. She has a very particular idea of what it is to govern. For her, the word government, the word to govern, the infinitive to govern, it means a particular thing. It means to stand in an authority relationship over someone else. So the idea is that there are governance structures that she sees, in all these facets of life in this feudal world. Because anywhere where one person is repeating to someone to whom they have a duty of obedience, there's a government relationship. Now, one thing that she points out, she brings this all back then to her notion of what equality is. Remember, for her, equality revolves around three dimensions. There's this authority relationship, there's this relationship of esteem, and there's this relationship of standing. And here you have a world where all three of these dimensions are oriented in a highly non-egalitarian, highly dominating way. You have pervasive authority without any impact, with very, very little input from folks that are under the authority. You have a world where some folks demand the fawning, bowing, scraping behavior of their underlings. And you have a world where the interests of folks at the top are given a lot more weight and attention by the whole system and the rules than the interests of those at the bottom. Okay. All right. So Anderson has this interesting section in her chapter 1. I'm not going to say too much about it, but I am at least going to point it out. She points to some key ideological supports, some key like concepts and ideas and understandings of the way things work and what's good and bad. Some key complexes of ideas and narratives like that support this hierarchical structure. There's three that she points to. One part is just this idea that God made us to be governed by someone. God sort of sets the tone for everything. God's the boss of all of us, and every one of us needs to have a God-like boss, that governs our behavior. So there's this idea of this great chain of being, starting from the king, going all the way down to the lowliest member of society. A second set of ideological ideals, or what have you, and all this is in the pejorative sense for Anderson, by the way. But a second set is there's this patriarchal set of ideas, and it's these ideas that someone like Gerda Lerner had in mind. It's this traditional account of the relationship between men and women, where there's something natural or maybe even divinely ordained about men's dominance and women's subordinates in everyday relationships. It's this male-led, this idea about the propriety, the goodness of and appropriateness, true to our nature or true to God's wishes of this relationship, and where the male has authority. The male figures in the household have authority over the women, particularly the men at the very top, the patriarch in any particular household. A third ideological support is this religious notion, this Christian notion of original sin, and this justifies particularly and is linked to this great chain of being. It's this idea that we're all innately evil, we're all innately sinful, so every one of us must have a watcher. Everyone must be monitored. Everyone must be governed by someone else. And I suppose the idea is, it's the hope that if everyone is being watched by another, maybe somehow that'll keep all of us on our better behavior. Okay. Now, one of Anderson's main observations is that starting in about the 16th century and then really getting going in the 17th century, there are changes. There are changes, ultimately in the way that we produce, in the way that we can make things, the best ways to produce goods, that are accompanied by changes in religious authorities. And what I have in mind here is, there's a struggle between Protestants and Catholics, where you're getting this Reformation that's pushing against the authority of the Catholic Church. So these changes that start in the 16th century allowed for significant portions of the population to wriggle out of this great chain of authority it allowed for certain masterless men to wriggle free of traditional lines of authority. So, prior to this point, it would be very hard to leave your duties assumed at birth, say, as a peasant living on a manor. There are various technological developments where the folks that the nobles at the top of these manors, they actually, for various reasons, they don't want to hold on to their peasants. And these same technological innovations also make it possible for the peasants to begin to make something like a livelihood for themselves. There are just more opportunities in the economy that are developing during this time period. Technology allows for this. And then also big movements at a global scale. There are marketplaces developing between countries that just creates like little opportunities for folks to wriggle out of these traditional lines of authority in their everyday lives where they're producing. And that's a big deal. You get this class of masterless men. And just the very existence of this class of folks, particularly as it gets bigger and bigger and more noticeable, and some people actually do okay in this life, it really undercuts these ideological supports that I just described. It calls into question the necessity of this great chain of being. So you get this world where people are able to escape from this old system, where people can be their own men. This is a highly precarious world because now you have to take care of yourself. You're not part of some bigger group. But it's also liberating. And then, as I mentioned, another key development here is you get this Protestant Reformation, where there's this struggle between this titanic struggle between Protestants and the Catholic Church, and that fractures that part of the great chain of being. And all this is called into question, and this creates opportunities for folks to wriggle free of religious authority. Okay. So now you have this set of folks, this set of masterless men, and this is a growing set of folks, and their economic livelihood it depends upon them being able to change even further and escape from and resist some of the entrenched privileges of folks in the existing power structure. So they're going to be a force for changing this, very intricate authority structure in many, many ways across all its dimensions. Because their livelihood depends upon these kinds of changes, and they're a growing part of the population. And some of them are actually acquiring a fair amount of wealth, and with it the power to make these demands. At the same time, these folks have more leeway to make demands like this because they managed to escape to some degree from these authority structures, and so they're not immediately beholden to some lord that can punish them right away for pushing for these changes. So these changes that allowed for the emergence of these masterless men now leads to a political movement to change the basic order of things. And so you see these constitutional demands coming from folks like this to limit the authority of the king, the lords, and the parliament, to make the king accountable to the parliament, and it's the parliament where a lot of these masterless men can be represented, and then to make the state accountable to the people. And these folks are also challenging the authority of the Church of England and priests more generally over parishioners. Some of them, they're kind of riding this egalitarian anti-authority wave, and some of them are even challenging the authority of men over women in the household, and they're also challenging the authority of guilds and mercantile monopolies over the artisans that work within those centers. And these folks are known as the Levellers, and you can see why they have that name. And these folks are sort of the political arm, the political manifestation of this emergence of the masterless men, some of whom have become quite wealthy as merchants working for themselves, self-employed folks. Okay. And there's a lot of description of this in chapter 1. And one thing I'll point you to is that there's a great deal of support for what we might call private property and free trade. So there's this root and branch petition of 1640 that called for the abolition of the episcopacy, which is a church structure. But the part that's most relevant to property and free trade, it complained of monopolies. So in this old system, the system would say, okay, this lord here, or this this duke, or what have you, well, this person's going to have a monopoly over this kind of production in this area. These masterless men, their livelihood depends upon being able to push those monopolies back. So they're complaining of these monopolies. Similarly, there are patents and tariffs that get in the way of their ability to engage in free trade on the market. And they also want to get out from under the thumb of the church, who's making all kinds of demands on them. They risk things like fines and excommunication for having their market open on holy days. So these folks are looking for ways to kind of carve out the sphere where they can be self-sufficient producers who have exclusive ownership of their goods, unimpeded by the nobility or the church, and that they're free to trade those goods on a voluntary basis. They're not required to produce for anybody. They're not required to give parts of it to the church or parts of it to some nobility as a kind of tithe. They're able to just be these self-sufficient producers, not under anyone's authority. They're just these actors out there in the marketplace. That's what they want. That's what the root and branch petition is trying to carve out for them. So this is the introduction. They're pushing for the introduction of a very different form of political economy, one that's organized around the principles of private property, where there are private individuals who have exclusive ownership of goods and their own services. And then it's a support for the construction of a free market where these things can be traded as opposed to given as demanded by feudal obligations. And as I mentioned, the livelihood of the masterless men depended on these freedoms. Their independence freed them from the fear of offending their masters, so they could push for these freedoms. Also, their growing wealth enabled them to push for these things as well. Their growing wealth and their growing numbers in the population. Okay, so Adam Smith is someone who is a theorist that's roughly aligned with these masterless men. And his writings, I think most of you folks will have heard of The Wealth of Nations. They're very well known for his ideas about the productivity of free market systems. The system where I just described, where folks have private ownership of their goods and their services, and there's a market where you can engage in a voluntary trade of these goods, for a price that you agree upon. And so in this free market, there's a form in which persons engage in voluntary contracts to exchange goods and services, and there is a freedom of entry into this marketplace. There's no monopolies. There's no rules saying that only certain people can be in this marketplace. Adam Smith is the apologist for this system. He is a progressive here because he is trying to change the system. Now, here's Anderson's big punchline. What she wants to point out is that this whole idea of this free market system, this whole idea that's coming out of the Levellers and later on by people like John Locke, she notes that a very important thread of this is the emphasis that this movement places on good governments and the emphasis it places on being free from servile dependency and its emphasis on the security that free markets bring. What's animating, and it's evident in all of The Wealth of Nations, is that folks like Adam Smith and then of course the Levellers, they want a world that has broken down these authority structures where there's no standing set of folks that have abiding authority over others like a lord does over its serf. or the church has over its petitioners. What these folks want is a world where no one is dominated. They want a world where people can meet as equals in a marketplace and exchange goods and services and money with one another through voluntary contracts. This is all at heart a highly egalitarian movement. Adam Smith is clearly an egalitarian progressive trying to introduce and consolidate institutional designs that'll move us from this highly inegalitarian and hierarchical dominating society to one that he hopes and the levelers hope will be much more equal. Something that takes the standing, the interests, and the say of each much more equally into account. And it's this market system where no one's interests really count for more. Rather, everyone has to go out there on the market and exchange their goods and services with one another in a voluntary way. Anderson, shows us in chapter 1 how this kind of thinking is not limited to the UK. She also introduces these figures in American history: Thomas Paine in the late 18th century, and Abraham Lincoln, the founder of the U.S. Republican Party and the President of the United States during the Civil War in the mid-19th century in the U.S. The idea that she points out, and I think this is an interesting feature of the U.S. Republican Party. The U.S. Republican Party was organized by folks who were proponents of this 18th and 19th century free market ideology. But what they wanted was this world that wasn't on the model of the old world where there are all these, feudal authority relationships. What they want is this world where everyone's out there in the free market freely exchanging their goods with one another through contracts and voluntary contraction on a voluntary basis on basically equal standing. Everyone's an equal in this free marketplace. So here's, I'll quote at length what Anderson says, kind of encapsulating the ideal that they're going for. Imagine a market economy in which nearly everyone either is self-employed as a yeoman farmer, artisan, or small merchant, or else is a worker in a small firm with high and rising wages, sufficient to enable enough savings so that one could purchase one's own farm or workshop after a few years, becoming self-sufficient. Markets would be perfectly competitive, so no one would enjoy market power over others. Profits would be low and everyone would have to work for a living, so labor would not be despised. Material inequality would be limited to individual differences in personal labor effort and skill, not to inequalities in birth, state-granted privileges, capital ownership, or command over others' labor. Everyone would meet on equal footing with everyone else. All would enjoy personal independence. No one would be subject to another's domination. You get this, this egalitarian paradise. That's what was animating these folks. And Anderson thinks this is very interesting. So the founder of the U.S. Republican Party, Lincoln, this key founder of the U.S. Republican Party, was motivated by this free market ideology in service of these egalitarian relations. That's the picture Anderson's trying to paint. Okay, so the implementation of this ideal is these free markets, these voluntary contracts, and private property that allows people to own things without the interference of others that they can then trade on these markets. And it's this world where you want to keep the state out. You want a small state because from the perspective of the folks that lived in that world, the state was the bringer of patents, monopolies, and personal privileges. The state was the thing that entrenched these hierarchical relationships. You just want to make the state as small as possible to just, and its main thing to do will be to create this market system where everyone can be these relatively free and equal self-sufficient agents trading in these markets. So here's a slide. You can consult it, but it basically says what I just said. Okay, now that's the end of Anderson's positive story about free market ideology. At the end of chapter 1, she says, okay, that was great. It was progressive, egalitarian. It had this tremendous degree of egalitarian promise. But there's something that Lincoln, Thomas Paine, Adam Smith, none of these folks anticipated. The huge change that was about to come in the political economy. They were writing for a world where it looked like it was possible to create this world where everyone is basically an actor with equal standing in this highly competitive marketplace, where you're a yeoman farmer working your own land, or you run your own little shop producing some good. Everyone is like this small self-employed unit, no more than 3 or 4 people working in these little things, maybe occasionally a workplace with like 10 people. And this is a highly egalitarian system. Everyone's just relating to one another as equals. Every agreement, every interaction is governed by a contract that says what the transaction will be. I will trade this if you do for you doing that. Highly equal, highly egalitarian possibility where everyone's roughly the same size economic actor trading their goods to make their way on this free market. The Industrial Revolution on Anderson's story changes everything. What comes into existence with the Industrial Revolution is these labor-intensive factories, the large firm and the workplace. In the Industrial Revolution, what folks learn is that there are economies of scale where you learn that if you can get 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people working in a factory together in a coordinated way, they will be able to produce much more efficiently and much more quickly than all these small proprietors out there. You can either make, say, a watch, or you can make some little good, Adam Smith's pin in the pin factory. You can make it with individual craftsmen doing it, but then if you can get some sort of machine going where each person in this giant factory does one little part, applies one little machine to do one little thing to make this larger product. If you get that kind of coordinated thing going with many people, you can produce a lot more efficiently and quickly and cheaply than these small artisan units. So what happens with the Industrial Revolution, it becomes crystal clear that economies of scale are overwhelming. They do overwhelm the economy of small proprietors. And what you get is you get all these small proprietors replaced with large enterprises that employ many workers. Now, the big point is that this development, the fact that these mass scale workplaces come to be the dominant units in the economy. Most people are working in a situation like that. That destroys the marketplace's egalitarian promise. The marketplace's ideology, egalitarian promise today, is ideological in the pejorative sense because now, because it was crafted for a world where people could realize relations of equality in these marketplaces. But now it's not possible in this world where people where the main thing they're going to do is that they're going to work in a large firm in an authority hierarchy under other folks, as opposed to working for themselves on a basis of free exchange for goods and services. So what you have is voluntary contracts among the ranks of the self-employed in the 18th and 19th century. This is the kind of relationship that people like Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Paine, and Adam Smith had in mind. You don't have authority relationships. There's no one set of persons bossing other people around, telling them what to do, deciding how their days will be organized, deciding how much they'll get paid, and so on. Now what you've got is a world where the main contract that keeps the economy going is this contract for labor, where what you do is you sell your labor for a wage. And in selling your labor, you enter into an authority relationship with someone, because selling your labor, you just say, okay, I'm going to go work for you. You tell me what to do. I'm going to do it. And you're going to set the terms of, and in that one transaction, you're going to set the terms of the way that workplace is organized. But the key idea is in this contract for labor, that's going to be a contract into an authority relationship. and that authority relationship is going to be backed by an asymmetrical dependency between worker and owner-employers. The idea is that in this relationship, it's very unlike, and in this contract, it's very unlike the contract anticipated between the contracts that you'd see in this marketplace of, say, yeoman farmers or artisans who are basically, equal in their economic standing and bargaining power. Rather, what you're going to see is you're going to see a world where now there's this one contract, this kind of contract, the contract for labor, where over and over again the employer side of the contract is going to have the advantage in terms of bargaining power. And with that advantage, they're going to be able to structure this whole relationship, the whole workplace relationship, which will be a relationship of authority, in ways that systematically favor the employer's interests over the employee's interests. So Anderson's idea is that this free market ideology that placed high value on the system of private property and free market is not tailored to the realities of the post-industrial revolution economy, where the primary market is a market that's organized around this highly unbalanced of power between workers and employers who are making these contracts. This changes everything. Now the free market ideology in its form developed for the 18th and 19th century, when it's imported without modification to contemporary society, it now becomes pejorative, because now it's an ideology that actually does not serve the interests of most people, the workers. Whereas in the past, there was a chance that most people were going to be these members of small self-sufficient units in a roughly equal playing field. There, that ideology actually was was non-pejorative. It was something that promised to support and mesh with the interests of most. Now, Anderson's arguing, unmodified, this ideology is pejorative. So here's what Anderson says. This is summing it up. The pre-industrial egalitarian's model of how to bring about a free society of equals through free markets via near universal self-employment was shattered. Advocates of laissez-faire, who blithely applied the earlier arguments for market society to a social context that brought about the very opposite of the effects that were predicted and celebrated by their predecessors, failed to recognize that the older arguments no longer applied. Thus arose a symbiotic relationship between libertarianism, that is, the folks that are really, shouting from the rooftops, the free market ideology today. Thus arose a symbiotic relationship between libertarianism and authoritarianism that blights our political discourse to this day. For what we have yet to adequately grasp is the nature of the challenge before us, private government. So here's the thing. Libertarians are misnamed, she argues, because what libertarians do is they purvey a pejorative ideology, an ideology that blinds us to the fact that most of us live under a highly inegalitarian, authoritarian structure where there isn't much freedom, not much liberty in our everyday workplace. That's her main claim. And so the libertarians for her are these forces of pejorative ideology, and they're doing it, interestingly, with an ideology that in its day was something that would have supported libertarianism, or liberty. It had great promise to support freedom and equality, because in its day it anticipated a world of roughly equal actors trading their goods on this free marketplace where there was equal bargaining power between everyone. That's not the world we live in. All right. Let me make one final point. That's really all I have to say, but I want to bring things into, kind of an even broader context for political philosophy when you kind of think of different actors in political philosophy. And it's going to be, and this point is about the two authors that Anderson compares at the very beginning of her chapter 1. She compares Adam Smith and Karl Marx. And the question, one way to think about it is like, okay, why are these two authors reacting so differently to basically the same basic set of ideas? Adam Smith is very excited, enthusiastic about the free market, and Karl Marx is upset about it, and sees its flaws and the various ways it immiserates people. And so, one thing you might think is, well, Karl Marx was someone who's egalitarian, perhaps egalitarian to a fault, and Adam Smith is not. Well, what Anderson is arguing is actually, no, they actually share egalitarian values. They actually are on the same page when it comes to what's important, what values we should be trying to achieve in our society. Where they both want to achieve relationships of non-domination, of freedom within this true and equality in this Rousseauian tradition. The key difference is that Adam Smith was theorizing in a pre-industrial revolution world. Karl Marx is is theorizing as an observer of the post-industrial revolution British economy as it's developing in the middle and late 19th century. That's the big difference. Same values, different take on this free market ideology because they occupy different spaces with respect to, in time and place, with respect to this innovation that makes the free market ideology something that is not as conducive to freedom and equality as it promised to be prior to the Industrial Revolution. Okay, that's all I have. I look forward to talking to you folks soon.